On April 12th, 1945, the toughest general in the United States Army walked into a place that made him vomit against a wooden wall. 8 months later, he was dead, and the German field marshal who had signed off on the massacre of 335 civilians outlived him by 15 years, smiling the whole time. This is the story they didn't put in the movie. April 12th, 1945, Ohrdruf, central Germany. The wind that morning carried a smell that even hardened American soldiers could not name. Not smoke, not gunpowder, not the copper stench of a battlefield. Something older, sweeter, wrong in a way that made men press handkerchiefs to their faces before they understood why. General George S. Patton, 60 years old, 4 stars on each shoulder, walked through the open gate of the Ohrdruf subcamp with his boots crunching on gravel. Behind him came Generals Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, 3 of the most powerful military men in the Western world, stepping into a place that had, until 48 hours earlier, been a functioning outpost of the Third Reich. They saw the bodies first, not dozens, not hundreds, piles. Men, reduced shapes that no longer resembled men. Skin stretched over bone like wet paper over sticks. Eyes open, staring at a sky they could not see. Some had been shot in the back of the head at the last moment when the SS guards realized the Americans were coming. Others had simply starved where they lay, too weak to move, too broken to protest. Patton, the man who had cursed his way across North Africa, who had slapped a shell-shocked soldier in a Sicilian hospital, who had driven his Third Army faster and farther than any American commander in modern history, walked 10 paces further into the camp. Then he turned aside, put one gloved hand against the wall of a wooden barracks and vomited. Eisenhower watched him, said nothing. Bradley looked away, giving his friend the small dignity of privacy. When Patton straightened, his face was pale, but his eyes had changed. The blue in them had gone flat. What? Cold, the color of steel left out in winter. He turned to a lieutenant standing nearby and gave an order that would echo through the coming weeks. "Get the mayor of this town," Patton said. "Get every civilian from Ohrdruf, men, women, teenagers, every German who lives within walking distance. I want them here by morning. They're going to see this. They're going to walk through every inch of it, and they're going to bury these bodies with their own hands." The lieutenant hesitated. "Sir, some of them may claim they didn't know." Patton's jaw tightened. "Then they'll learn." That night, in the requisition farmhouse where Patton set up his temporary quarters, he sat alone at a wooden table and opened his personal diary. The candle beside him guttered in the draft. He wrote, in the tight, angular hand that had become familiar to his aides. He described the camp. He described the smell. He described the way the bodies had been stacked, the way the surviving prisoners had looked at him with eyes that could no longer register hope or fear. And then he wrote a sentence that historians would return to again and again in the decades to come. He wrote that he had never in his life imagined such degradation could exist. But then, on the next page, he wrote something else, something that did not fit the image of the outraged liberator. He wrote about the discipline of the German military, about the tragedy of a professional soldier class being wasted on a madman's cause. He wrote about the Russians, whom he already distrusted more than he distrusted the surrendering enemy in front of him. Here was the paradox that would define the next 8 months of George Patton's life. He hated what he had seen at Ohrdruf. He hated the regime that had built it. But he did not, in his private thoughts, hate the men who had worn the field gray uniform of the Wehrmacht. He admired their tradition. He admired their bearing. He admired, God help him, the Prussian discipline that he believed America itself lacked. And that private admiration, that stubborn refusal to see the Wehrmacht as fully complicit in the crimes he had just witnessed, would eventually destroy his career. 500 kilometers to the south, in a fortified command post buried in the Bavarian Alps, another 60-year-old general was preparing for a very different kind of mourning. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. The Americans who studied him called him Smiling Albert. Photographers had captured that grin dozens of times. Broad, disarming, almost boyish under the heavy cap of the Luftwaffe. He looked in those pictures like a favorite uncle, a country doctor, a man you would trust with your children. He had taken command of the Western Front from Gerd von Rundstedt in March of 1945, and by late April was commanding all remaining German forces in the south, in what the Reich still called the Alpine Theater. The war was collapsing around him. Berlin was burning. Hitler was hiding underground with Eva Braun and a cyanide capsule. The Reich was days from disintegration, and Albert Kesselring, 60 years old, was still issuing orders to fight. He believed, or told himself he believed, that his duty was to hold ground, to slow the American and British advance, to buy time, though for what he could no longer clearly say. The old soldier's reflex had taken over the old soldier's mind. The smile in the photographs hid something else, something that the Americans interrogating him later would slowly, painstakingly uncover. 14 months earlier, in March 1944, Italian partisans had detonated a bomb on the Via Rasella in Rome, killing 33 German policemen. Hitler had demanded reprisal, 10 Italians for every German dead. The order had come down through the chain of command, and Albert Kesselring, the smiling field marshal, had signed off on it. 335 Italian men and boys were taken to a network of caves outside Rome called the Ardeatine. They were shot in the back of the head, one by one, over the course of a single afternoon. When the killers ran out of bullets in some cases, they used the last rounds in their pistols and moved on to the next victim. When they were finished, they collapsed the cave entrances with explosives to hide the bodies. Albert Kesselring, in his post-war testimony, would insist that the reprisal was legal, proportionate, within the customs of war. The smile in the photographs never quite reached his eyes. Here is the first thing you need to understand about the story you are about to hear. The men who wore Wehrmacht uniforms in 1945 were not, as a group, innocent professionals dragged unwillingly into a criminal war. That the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, would take root in the years after the surrender, cultivated by the very officers who most needed it to be true. But it was not true then, and it is not true now. On July 24th, 1944, 4 days after Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's bomb failed to kill Adolf Hitler at the Wolf's Lair, an order came down from the Führer himself. From that day forward, every soldier of the Wehrmacht, from the lowest private to the highest field marshal, was required to abandon the traditional military salute and replace it with the stiff-armed Nazi greeting, the Hitlergruß, the German salute. There would be no more clicking of heels, and touching of caps. There would be no more separation between the army and the party. Every man in uniform would raise his arm to Adolf Hitler, or he would answer for his refusal. This was not a symbolic change. It was a formal, legal, disciplinary rewriting of what it meant to be a German officer. From that summer forward, there was no such thing as a Wehrmacht man who stood outside Nazi ideology. There were only men who had raised their arms and men who had refused and been punished. Albert Kesselring raised his arm. So did every general who would still be alive to sign a surrender document in May of 1945. This is the fact that George Patton, walking through Ohrdruf on that April morning, already understood in his bones. And it is the fact that the men who would soon be his prisoners would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain away. By late April 1945, the geography of the war had shrunk to a handful of pockets, Berlin encircled by the Red Army. The northern coast held by remnants of Grand Admiral Dönitz' forces, and in the south, the Alpines redoubt that Kesselring still nominally commanded, though its garrison was starving, its fuel was exhausted, and its officers were beginning to look at one another with a question none of them wanted to speak aloud. When do we stop? Patton's Third Army, meanwhile, was tearing across southern Germany at a speed that stunned even his own staff officers. Regensburg fell. Passau fell. His tanks were driving into Czechoslovakia, into Austria, sweeping up entire divisions of surrendering German soldiers who threw down their weapons at the sight of the first Sherman coming over a hill. On May 5th, in a schoolhouse in the town of Hahar outside Munich, General Hermann Forch, 50 years old, commander of Army Group G, signed the surrender of his forces to the American 6th Army Group under General Jacob Devers. The photograph taken that day survives. Forch stands in his field gray uniform, cap in hand, his face composed into the careful blankness that German officers had been trained to display in the presence of enemies. Devers, an American, sits across from him at a school desk. There is no drama in the image, no shouting, just the paperwork of a broken empire being formally acknowledged. But behind that photograph, in the ranks of the surrendering officers, something else was happening. Something that the surface calm of the ceremony concealed. Many of these men, veterans of years of Nazi indoctrination, still believed. Not in victory. Victory was gone, but in the ideology that had promised victory, in the racial superiority that had justified the Eastern campaigns, in the myth that they personally had done nothing wrong, that the war had been fought honorably by them, and that whatever atrocities had occurred, they had been committed by others. The SS, the party functionaries, the camp guards, someone else, always someone else's. For some 10 days after Forch's surrender on May 15th, 1945, American soldiers approached Field Marshal Albert Kesselring in the town of Saalfelden in the Austrian Alps. He surrendered without resistance. He smiled for the cameras. He offered his hand to the American officers, and one of them, uncertain what protocol demanded, took it. Within hours, Kesselring was in American custody, being transported north for interrogation. His destination in the coming weeks would include a detention facility near Augsburg, where the highest-ranking officers of the defeated Reich were being processed by American intelligence. And it was in Augsburg, in the fading days of May 1945, that the paths of George Patton and Albert Kesselring would come close enough to touch. Not in the mythic courtyard confrontation of legend, not with stripped uniforms and thrown blankets, but in something quieter, more bureaucratic, and in the end far more revealing about what the post-war world would become. Patton had been made military governor of Bavaria. The Third Army, his Third Army, was now responsible for administering a shattered region containing hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war, thousands of former constraint camp inmates who could barely stand, and a civilian population that veered between terror, resentment, and a strange collective amnesia about what had just happened to their country. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had issued Directive JCS 1067. It was blunt. Germany was to be treated as a defeated enemy nation, not as a liberated country. There would be no fraternization, no leniency. Former Nazi Party members were to be removed from every position of authority. Denazification was to be pursued systematically, methodically, without exception. Patton read the directive, and Patton, in the privacy of his diary, began to argue with it. He wrote that the policy was naive, that removing every former party member would leave Germany without the trained administrators needed to run its cities, its trains, its power plants. He wrote that the real enemy, the enemy that mattered for the future, was not the defeated Wehrmacht officers standing in a prison camp. The real enemy was the Red Army, sitting on the Elbe, watching, waiting. He wrote that America would need Germany, would need German soldiers, would need German intelligence, and soon. He was, in one sense, correct. Within a year, American policy would begin to shift. Reinhard Gehlen, the former head of the Wehrmacht's intelligence apparatus for the Eastern Front, would be recruited by American intelligence in the summer of 1946. His organization, staffed with former Nazi officers, would eventually become the foundation of West German intelligence. Patton saw this coming. In his diary, he all but predicted it. But he was also, in another sense, catastrophically wrong, because he confused the pragmatic necessity of using some former officers with a moral judgment that they had not been so bad after all. He began to write in those private pages sentences that, if published, would have destroyed him instantly, about Jews, about Russians, about the tragedy of punished German soldiers for what he increasingly viewed as political rather than criminal conduct. The man who had wept at Ohrdruf and vomited at the sight of the dead was, 3 weeks later, writing that perhaps the Denazification program was going too far. This is the George Patton that history has largely chosen to forget. Not the hero of the film. Not the profane, prayer-loving liberator. The other one, the one who could look at the photographs of the camps and, in the next breath, wonder whether the men who had served the regime that built them really deserved to lose their pensions. In the interrogation rooms of Augsburg, meanwhile, Albert Kesselring was giving his own version of events. He had done his duty. He had followed orders. He had, of course, known nothing of the camps. The reprisal at the Ohrdruf had been a regrettable but legally sanctioned response to partisan terrorism. He was a soldier. He had served his country. He held no personal animosity toward the Allies. He was, in fact, prepared to cooperate fully with the post-war reconstruction of Germany. He smiled through most of it. American interrogators noted the smile in their reports. Some found it charming. Some found it deeply unsettling. None of them, in the summer of 1945, understood what the smile actually concealed. Because Albert Kesselring, the smiling field marshal, was already constructing something. Not a defense in the narrow legal sense, something larger, a story, a myth.
A version of the war in which the Wehrmacht had been a professional army caught up in a criminal regime, guilty perhaps of following the wrong orders, but never of designing the horrors that had emerged from those orders.
The myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the myth that would allow tens of thousands of former German officers to return to civilian life, to political life, to eventually, in some cases, military life again in the new West German army of the 1950s. The myth that would take decades of historical scholarship to finally dismantle. That myth was being born in the interrogation rooms of Augsburg in the summer of 1945. Kesselring, 60 years old, still smiling, was one of its principal architects, and George Patton, 60 years old, half admiring, half horrified, was in his own way about to help build it. Here is where the story turns. Because what was coming next, in the summer of 1945, was not a single dramatic confrontation in a courtyard. It was slower than that, uglier, more morally complicated than any single scene could contain. It was the collision of a general who had seen the camps and could not unsee them with a class of officers who had spent the war telling themselves that the camps had nothing to do with them. It was the collision of an American occupation policy that demanded moral reckoning with a German officer corps that had spent 12 years learning to salute rather than to think. And it was the collision of Patton's private admiration for the Prussian military tradition with the growing evidence that its Prussian military tradition had, in the end, saluted Adolf Hitler as readily as any street brawler in Munich. Something was going to break. The question that hung over the summer of 1945 in the interrogation rooms and the prison camps and the requisition villas where American officers drank captured brandy and argued about what to do with their prisoners was simple. Who was going to break first? The old soldier who had walked through Ohrdruf and vomited, or the smiling field marshal who had signed the death warrant at the Ardeatine and was already, in the summer of his defeat, planning his return to respectability? The answer, when it came, would surprise everyone, including the two men themselves. May 1945. The war in Europe was officially over. On paper. But in the requisitioned schoolhouses and beer halls and country estates of Bavaria, a different kind of war was just beginning. A quieter one. Fought with paperwork instead of artillery. Fought with questions instead of bullets. And every man who had worn the field gray uniform of the Wehrmacht was about to discover that surrender did not mean the end of the reckoning. Surrender was only the beginning. George Patton stood on the balcony of his new headquarters in Bad Tölz, a resort town nestled in the Alpine foothills south of Munich. 60 years old. 4 stars, military governor of Bavaria. Below him in the streets, columns of American trucks moved supplies. Somewhere out beyond the mountains, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners sat behind barbed wire, waiting to learn what would happen to them. Patton lit a cigar. The smoke curled up into the cold morning air. He had a problem. The problem was not the war. The war, he understood. The war he had won. The problem was what came after the war, and the men who now sat in prison camps, and the pieces of paper piling up on his desk with names and photographs and dossiers that all said the same thing. Every one of these men had raised his arm to Hitler, Down in the camps, the salutes had not stopped. American guards reported it in memos that made their way up the chain of command. German officers held behind wire in facilities across Bavaria and the Rhineland were still greeting each other with the stiff-armed Hitlergruß, still clicking their heels, still addressing senior officers with the formal ideological courtesies of the Reichs of WWII. Some of them, when American officers approached, would shift into a traditional military salute at the last moment, as if hoping no one had noticed the arm that had begun to rise in a different direction. Others made no such adjustment. They saluted Hitler openly in front of their captors because they no longer knew how else to be soldiers. 9 months of Hitler's July 1944 order had done its work. The Nazi salute was no longer a gesture. It was a reflex, muscle memory fused with ideology until the two could not be separated. You could not simply tell these men to stop. The arm rose on its own. In Augsburg, in the interrogation rooms, the process was slower and stranger. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, 60 years old, composed and unhurried, sat across the table from American intelligence officers day after day. He answered every question. He offered every courtesy. He apologized in his careful diplomatic German for any confusion, any misunderstanding, any regrettable event that had occurred under his command. The Ohrdruf caves came up. 335 men and boys shot in the back of the head over the course of a single afternoon. Kesselring did not deny his role. He explained it. He had followed orders. The reprisal ratio of 10 Italians for every German dead had been established at higher levels. He had signed the paperwork. He said, believed at the time that this was legally permissible under the customs of war. The American officer taking notes wrote a single word in the margin pad, smiling. That was what unsettled them most. Not the crime. The men in that room had heard about worse crimes by then. What unsettled them was the affect, the pleasant, avuncular tone, the occasional small laugh at his own expense, the manner of a man who had been asked to explain a scheduling error. Kesselring was not defending himself in the way a guilty man defends himself. He was defending himself in the way a man defends a completed piece of work. He had done his job. He had served his country. The details were regrettable, but the framework was sound. He was, without yet knowing it, giving the Americans the first draft of a story that would outlive him by decades. Meanwhile, across the American zone of occupation, a piece of paper was landing on every German man's kitchen table. It was called the Fragebogen, the questionnaire. 131 questions printed on cheap paper in blocky German type, distributed to millions of Germans in the summer and autumn of 1945. Have you ever been a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party? Have you ever been a member of the SS? Have you ever been a member of the SA, the Hitler Youth, the German Labor Front, the National Socialist Motor Corps? The list went on. Page after page of organizational memberships, ranks held, dates joined, dates left. The Americans wanted to know, for every adult German man, exactly how deep his participation in the machinery of the Reich had gone. The results, when they were compiled, were staggering. Roughly 1 in every 5 adult Germans had been a member of the Nazi Party itself. Millions more had belonged to affiliated organizations, and among the officer corps of the Wehrmacht, the numbers were higher still. Not every officer had joined the party formally, but the great majority had belonged to at least one of the auxiliary organizations, had raised the flag at ceremonies, had signed the loyalty oath, had participated in ways large and small in the ideological life of the Reich. The myth of the apolitical German officer, the pure professional soldier untainted by ideology, was dying on those questionnaires. Patton read the summaries. Patton, who had walked through Ohrdruf, who had vomited in the shadow of the barracks, sat in Bad Turz reading numbers that confirmed everything the camps had already told him. And still in his private diary he wrote what he wrote. The order came down from Supreme Headquarters in April, before the war even ended. Every American soldier who could be spared, every German civilian who could be rounded up, was to be brought through the liberated camps, to see, to smell, to bury. Patton had already begun this in Ohrdruf. Now, across Bavaria, the practice expanded. Villagers from the towns around Dachau were marched through the crematoria of Dachau. Farmers who had lived within sight of the guard towers were made to walk past the piles of striped uniforms that no one would ever wear again. And in the prisoner of war camps, the film crews arrived. Eisenhower had ordered the camps filmed. Every angle, every atrocity, every witness. He had understood from the moment he first walked through a liberated camp himself that no one would believe this, that the scale of it, the industrial nature of it, would seem impossible even to the men who had seen it with their own eyes. So he had ordered the cameras. Now, those films were being shown to capture German officers. The projectors were set up in mess halls and requisitioned cinemas. The officers were marched in and made to sit. The lights went down. The images began. Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. Scuttle survivors staring into the lens. Bodies being pushed by American bulldozers into mass graves because there was no other way to move so many at once. Guards being made to carry the dead by hand, their faces frozen in a mixture of shame and disbelief. Some of the German officers watched with faces of stone. Some closed their eyes and were forced by American MPs to open them. Some wept openly. Some vomited in the aisles, as Patton himself had vomited in April. And a certain number, when the lights came back up, said the same thing that Wehrmacht officers had been saying since the first camp was liberated. We did not know. The Americans running these screenings had heard it so often that they had stopped arguing with it. They simply noted it in their reports. Subject claims no prior knowledge. Subject claims regional ignorance. Subject claims chain of command deflection. The words changed. The claim did not. Here is what Patton was wrestling with in the summer of his greatest command. He believed the camps. He had seen the camps. He would defend to the end of his life the moral necessity of destroying the regime that had built the camps. But he did not, in his heart, that the Wehrmacht as an institution had built them. He believed, or wanted to believe, that the camps had been the work of the SS, of the party, of the ideological hardcore. He believed that the ordinary field marshal, the ordinary general, the ordinary colonel had been a soldier in a soldier's war, and that punishing these men as if they were death camp guards was a category error that would leave America without allies in the coming struggle against Stalin. He wrote this down in private, in his diary, in letters to his wife. He wrote it in a form that, if it had been made public in the summer of 1945, would have ended his career on the spot. On September 14th, 1945, he wrote a sentence that historians have been chewing over ever since. He wrote about the Denazification program and the way it was being administered in his zone. He suggested that the Nazi Party, was in essence comparable to the ordinary political parties of the United States, that most party members had joined for professional reasons, the way a Kansas farmer might join the Republicans or a Chicago machinist might join the Democrats. That treating them all as ideological criminals was, in his private judgment, a mistake. This was the man who had walked through Ohrdruf. This was the man who had ordered the mayor of the town to bring every civilian to bury the dead. This was the same man. The paradox was not resolvable. It sat inside George Patton like two competing signals, and it would eventually tear his command apart. By late summer, the pattern in the interrogation rooms of Augsburg had become clear. Kesselring was not going to break. Not in the way that some American officers had hoped. He was not going to weep and confess and beg for mercy. He was going to smile and cooperate and answer every question with the practiced calm of a man who had already decided how the story of his life would be told. He was building his defense in real time. The Wehrmacht had been professional. The Wehrmacht had been separate. The Wehrmacht had followed lawful orders in an unlawful time. Whatever crimes had occurred, they had been committed elsewhere by other institutions, under other flags. The Americans wrote it all down. Some of them believed him. Some of them did not. All of them recognized that his testimony, his memoirs, his carefully constructed narrative would eventually reach a German public desperate to believe that their fathers and brothers and sons had not been part of what the camps revealed. Kesselring was giving them a way out, and in the alpine resort of Bad Tölz, George Patton, without fully understanding what he was doing, was preparing to give the same gift. He was about to say, in front of American reporters, on the record, that the Nazi Party had not been so different from the political parties of home. And that sentence, once spoken, would end everything. The summer of 1945 was almost over. The reckoning that Patton had begun at Ohrdruf and the reckoning that Kesselring had already begun to deflect in Augsburg were about to collide in a single room on a single afternoon in front of a small group of American journalists who had come expecting nothing more than a routine press briefing. The old soldier who had vomited in April was about to speak words that even his closest friends could not defend. And the smiling field marshal, sitting in his cell hundreds of kilometers away, was about to receive, without lifting a finger, the greatest political gift the American occupation would ever give him. September 22nd, 1945, Bad Tölz, Bavaria. The room was small, a conference table, a dozen folding chairs, a handful of American reporters, notebooks open, pencils ready. Outside the window, the mountains rose blue and cold against the September sky. George Patton walked in and took his seat at the head of the table. 60 years old. His hair, once dark, had turned almost fully white in the 12 months since the Ardennes. He wore his 4 stars. He wore his ivory-handled pistols. He wore the uniform of the general who had liberated more European ground faster than any American commander in the war. He also wore the expression of a man who had not slept well in weeks. The reporters asked their questions, the routine ones first. How was denazification progressing in his zone? How many former officials had been removed? What was the timeline for civilian administration? Patton answered, His answers were shorter than they might have been 6 months earlier, blunter. There was an impatience in them now that no aid had been able to smooth away.
And then one of the reporters asked the question that would end his career.
But at our best,
The reporter asked, in essence, whether Patton had been dragging his feet on the removal of former Nazi Party members from positions of authority in Bavaria.
whether the pace of denazification in his zone was slower than in others, whether he understood the political importance of a thorough purge. Patton leaned back in his chair, and then he said it. He said, in words that would be quoted in every American paper within days, that the Nazi thing was just like a Democratic-Republican election fight back home. That most people who had joined the party had joined for the same reasons. Americans joined the Democrats or the Republicans because it was expected, because it was necessary for a career, because it was what everyone else was doing. He said it as if it were common sense, as if he were explaining something obvious to a room of slow students. The reporters wrote it down, every word, and for a moment they were not sure what they had just heard. The story hit the American papers within 72 hours. Patton compares Nazis to Democrats and Republicans. Patton defends former party members. Patton undermines Allied policy on denazification. Eisenhower read the reports at his headquarters in Frankfurt. He put the paper down. He picked it up again. He read it a second time. Then he sent for Patton. The meeting between the two men took place on September 28, 1945. There is no full transcript. What survives are the notes of aides, the memoirs written years later, and the outcome, which was unambiguous. On October 7, 1945, Eisenhower formally relieved George Patton of command of the Third Army, the army Patton had built, the army he had driven across France, across Germany, into Czechoslovakia, the army whose flag had flown over Bad Tölz all summer. That command was taken from him. He was given, in exchange, a paper posting, command of the 15th Army, which was not really an army at all. It was a headquarters unit assembled to write the official history of the war in Europe. A desk, a typewriter, a staff of historians. For George Patton, this was worse than a firing. It was an exile, a public humiliation designed to make clear that the general who had won so much ground had lost the political war entirely. He accepted the posting. He shook Eisenhower's hand. He walked out of the meeting and, according to one aide, did not speak for the rest of the afternoon. He had walked through Ohrdruf. He had vomited in the shadow of the barracks. He had ordered the mayor of the town to bring every civilian to bury the dead. And now he was being sent to write history because he had said, in a moment of exhausted frankness, something that even his closest friends could not defend. The autumn came early in Bavaria that year. Patton took up his new duties. He wrote letters home. He hunted. He drank. He rode his horses when the weather permitted. He was, by all accounts, restless in a way that his family had not seen before. A man who had spent his entire adult life moving forward at speed, now confined to a room full of filing cabinets. On December 9th, 1945, he was riding in a car outside the town of Mannheim. He was on his way to a pheasant hunt. The car, driven by a young sergeant, collided with an American Army truck at a road intersection near Käfertal on the outskirts of Mannheim. The collision was not, by the standards of highway accidents, especially violent. The other passengers were largely unhurt, but Patton, sitting in the back seat, was thrown forward. His head and neck struck the metal frame of the glass partition, separating the driver's compartment from the rear. His neck was broken at the third and fourth cervical vertebrae, leaving him paralyzed from the neck down. He was taken to a military hospital in Heidelberg. He spent 12 days there, unable to move, alert to everything happening around him. His wife Beatrice flew from the United States to be at his bedside. Doctors did what could be done, which was very little. On December 21st, 1945, at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, George S. Patton died in his sleep. He was 60 years old. He had been military governor of Bavaria for less than 5 months. He was buried at the American Cemetery in Hamm, Luxembourg, alongside soldiers of the Third Army who had fallen in the Battle of the Bulge. That was where he had wanted to lie, among his men, 600 kilometers to the south in a British military prison. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring was still alive, still composed, still building his defense with the same steady calm he had worn through every American interrogation. He had been transferred from American custody to British jurisdictions to stand trial for the Ohrdruf massacre and for the shooting of Italian civilians during the anti-partisan camps of 1944. The trial began in Venice in February of 1947. It lasted 3 months. The evidence was overwhelming. 335 men and boys executed in a cave. Kesselring's signature on the order. His acknowledgement in interrogation that he had believed the reprisal legally permissible. On May 6, 1947, the court sentenced Albert Kesselring to death by firing squad. He received the verdict with the same expression he had worn in every photograph. Posed, almost pleasant. The smile of a man who had already begun writing the next chapter of his defense. The sentence was never carried out. Within weeks, British and American voices began to argue that the sentence was excessive, that Kesselring had been a soldier following orders in a legally ambiguous situation, that executing a former field marshal in the tense atmosphere of early Cold War Europe would send the wrong signal, not just to the Germans, whose cooperation the West now urgently needed against the Soviets, but to the international military community itself. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Then, in October of 1952, on grounds of ill health, Albert Kesselring was released. He was 67 years old. He walked out of prison, he returned to West Germany, and immediately began writing his memoirs. The book he produced, published in German in 1953 under the title Soldat bis zum letzten Tag, or Soldier to the Last Day, became one of the founding texts of the post-war German officer myth. In it, Kesselring described the Wehrmacht as it had always described itself to itself: professional, apolitical, honorable, a body of trained soldiers who had served their country in a difficult time and who bore no institutional responsibility for the crimes of the regime. The camps were mentioned in passing. The Ohrdruf was defended as a regrettable but legally sound reprisal. The great mass of the memoir was devoted to campaign details, to admire portraits of fellow officers, to the tone of a professional man reflecting on a long career. The book sold well. It was translated into English. It was read quietly and approvingly by American military officers who were then engaged in building the new West German Army, the Bundeswehr, which would formally come into existence in November of 1955. And Kesselring for the remaining years of his life, became a respected figure in veterans associations across West Germany. He spoke at reunions. He signed autographs. He gave interviews in which he expressed his hope that a new generation of German soldiers would carry forward the professional traditions of their fathers. He was also, it must be said, a controversial figure. Italian veterans groups protested his release. German writers and journalists on the left denounced him. But in the veterans' halls and the officers' clubs of the young Federal Republic, he was welcomed home as one of their own. He died on July 16th, 1960, of a heart attack at the age of 74. He was buried with military honors. He had outlived George Patton by nearly 15 years. Here is the harder truth, the one that closes this story and that most tellings of the American occupation of Germany prefer to leave out. In the summer of 1946, only months after Patton's death, American intelligence quietly signed an agreement with a former Wehrmacht general named Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen had run German military intelligence on the Eastern Front. He knew the Soviet order of battle better than any man alive. He had, in the final weeks of the war, buried his files in the Bavarian Alps and then walked into American custody, offering to trade them for his freedom. The Americans said yes. The organization Gehlen built, staffed with former Wehrmacht and SS officers, became the foundation of West German intelligence. It fed information to the CIA throughout the early Cold War. It was, in the strategic sense, exactly the kind of arrangement that Patton had privately argued for in his diary in the summer of 1945. The general who had said it out loud lost his command. The generals who had built quiet arrangements behind closed doors kept theirs and passed them to a new generation. This is the paradox at the center of the story. Patton was punished in the end for saying honestly what American policy was already beginning to do quietly. He was not wrong about the coming struggle with the Soviets. He was not wrong that the West would end up using former Wehrmacht officers. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong, about what such use would mean for the moral clarity of the American cause. He confused pragmatic necessity with moral absolution. He gave Kesselring, in his final press conference, a gift greater than any lawyer could have provided. He said front of the American press that the Nazis had been ordinary men. And Kesselring, quietly, in his cell, in his interrogation room, in the pages of his eventual memoir, made a career of proving him right. The lesson, if there is one, is not comfortable. It is not the lesson of the film. It is not the lesson of the myth. It is not the story of a good general who confronted evil and destroyed it. It is the story of two 60-year-old men born in the same year, shaped by the same century of European war. One of them walked into a concentration camp and vomited. The other one signed the order at the Guillotine and smiled for the cameras. And in the end, the one who vomited was destroyed by his own inability to hold two ideas at once. And the one who smiled walked free, wrote his memoir, and shaped how his country would remember its own war for the next 50 years. George Patton was buried in Luxembourg among his soldiers. Albert Kesselring was buried in Bad Nauheim with military honors from a republic that had officially disowned everything he had served. The post-war world was not built by the men who had the clearest moral vision. It was built by the men who understood how to survive the reckoning. Kesselring understood. Patton, in the end, did not. The camp stood empty by the winter of 1945. The salutes had stopped. The uniforms had been folded away. But the story of who had done what and who would be held responsible and who would write the history was only just beginning. And the men who wrote it were, more often than not, the men who had smiled through their interrogations. Oh, that is the war after the war. That is the reckoning that Patton did not live to see completed. And it is the reason why, 80 years later, the question of what the Wehrmacht was and what it did, and who among its officers deserves to be remembered as a soldier and who as an accomplice, is still being fought over by historians who understand that the first draft of the answers was written not on the battlefield, but in the interrogation rooms of Augsburg and in the small conference room in Bad Stolz, where an exhausted American general said the words that ended his command. The old soldier lost. The smiling field marshal won. And history, in the end, is written by the ones who are still standing when the smoke clears.